This episode is going to blow your mind. If you thought the benefits and risks to many routine medical procedures and common medications were clear-cut, then prepare to have your world flipped completely upside down. In this episode, Dr. Erik Rifkin PhD, author of The Illusion of Certainty, and most recently his book Interpreting Health Benefits and Risks, takes us on a journey explaining how statistics for many commonplace medical procedures and treatments do not mean what you think they mean. And if you knew the absolute truth, you may very likely make a very different choice. Join us as we take a clear look at the health risks and benefits of cholesterol-lowering medications, mammograms, colonoscopies, bone density scans, PSA or prostate-specific antigen testing, and a daily aspirin in the prevention of heart disease and stroke. Welcome to the Inspire Health Podcast. Your life is about to get a whole lot better. Have you ever felt like you tried everything and yet still couldn't find the answers or the solutions that you were seeking? Whether you're dealing with chronic illness, physical or emotional pain, I want you to know that your body is the most sophisticated machine on planet Earth. Your body holds unfathomable wisdom. Trust in it and learn from it. Know that there are answers and there are solutions to your specific health challenges. And we will be uncovering all of them here on the Inspire Health Podcast. I'm so excited to be a part of your healing journey. Your transformation starts now. Welcome back to another episode of the Inspire Health Podcast. I have a fascinating guest with me today, Erik Rifkin, PhD. He's an environmental scientist and an expert in human health risk assessment. He's the author of two books, The Illusion of Certainty that came out in 2007, and Interpreting Health Benefits and Risks in 2015, both published by Springer. These books address the need for shared decision-making between doctor and patient. The books focus on a unique graphic developed by Dr. Rifkin, which is designed to facilitate doctor-patient communication. Dr. Rifkin is the author of articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals, and his broad experience includes the communication of health risks and benefits to groups concerned with and interested in this issue. Dr. Rifkin, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Jason. I appreciate it, and I certainly hope some of the folks who will be listening to this will get some benefit from it.
Quite honestly, I think this is going to blow some people's minds as we go through all of this information. I know in general, when I hear the word stats or statistics, usually I get a little bit bored and think that it's going to be pretty dreary information. But when I read both of your books, I literally almost gasping out loud sometimes at what was coming up that I was reading. And my wife would have to look over and ask me, what are you reading? What's going on? And so I just knew I needed to get in touch with you to share it because I really think it is hugely, hugely important for the public to understand. So to start it off, how did an environmental scientist end up being so involved in risk and benefit assessment, especially when it comes to the healthcare industry and looking at medical testing and procedures?
That's a really good question. And had you asked me back when I got my PhD in marine biology, I would have no way to answer your question at all. But what happened was I spent a couple of years, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 years, as a professor at 2 different institutions. And I became interested in taking care of and looking out for the marine environment. And I was looking at why things were problematic and why people had different thoughts about that. For example, I would go to meetings where industry would get up and give their perspective and present numbers, which sounded pretty good. The environmental community would get up and say just the opposite, and the government was always someplace in between. But I thought it was really inappropriate for this to happen and for people to have to interpret what was going on. And that's how it started. And then I realized that I wasn't going to be able to follow this up. And I was intrigued with it. I was intrigued with how information gets communicated to communities and to government agencies. And so I started my own consulting firm a very long time ago. And we focused on this type of issue and these types of problems. And initially, I stayed with the problems that an environmental scientist would. I discussed how pollutants and contaminants in the air and in the water and on the land needed to be addressed and needed to be addressed correctly. But it was very difficult because there were a lot of organisms around and you had to look at different species and you had to do a great deal of research, which I knew that people without the training would not be able to comprehend. So I looked for a more simple example, and I thought one organism would be appropriate, and that would be us, and therefore the medical community must really know what they're doing, because of course we're more interested in people than we are any other living animal. And I began to look into how they were making their decisions. And all of a sudden it occurred to me that there was a major problem. And so I began to look into it. And it wasn't something that I came up with. The theaters are what I came up with, and I'll talk about those momentarily. But there were a lot of articles, and those articles said that a certain type of statistics were just no good and other types were good, and most of the pharmaceutical companies and hospitals and a number of other groups were using the method, the statistical method that wasn't any good. And I found that hard to believe, but unfortunately, that happened to be the case. And that's how I got into it. And then, as you had mentioned earlier, I wrote a couple of books, and a couple of articles in the peer-reviewed literature on this. We gave many talks to hospitals and to medical schools and to health insurance companies. And while what I said, and we'll be going over this shortly, I'm sure, resonated strongly with them, the process that we have here in the United States is so unclear and has so many pieces to it that no one really knew how to take the next step. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And from going over your books, a big part of what feels like one of the main focuses as to why you're doing this work is the importance of shared decision-making between patients and physicians. How did you end up with such a focus in that area and that becoming such an important piece to work with?
It's about shared decision-making?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, shared decision-making is a wonderful concept, and it's a concept that everybody would like to buy into. It sort of has a great deal of motherhood associated with it, and it's appropriate for doctors and patients to talk about what the problem is and for patients to understand. And in my view, that patients should make the final decision, because determining whether you move ahead or not is a basis of whether you are risk averse or not. There are pros and cons to everything you do. This isn't in the end a medical decision, but the doctors can help you understand what the issues are. Well, unfortunately, shared decision-making is still a slogan, and no one pays a great deal of attention to it. And they've done a number of studies where they've asked patients, would you like to be involved in shared decision-making and make the decisions with your doctors? The answers are invariably yes. However, when it comes down to evaluating the studies, only about 15% of those patients really want to make the decision in the end. And so they leave it to the doctor. And given the situation, doctors are under a number of constraints and have to follow a number of pathways, and patients are different. So you find people doing things they might not want to do and therefore don't do. So that's my sense of where shared decision-making is and where it should be.
And I know in your book, you talk about a bit of a personal example at the beginning of the book that you had gone through where you first, I think it was with your son early on, where you made some choices around what the doctor had said and then what you decided to do?
Could you, I apologize, something went wrong with the hearing here, so go ahead.
Okay. In your first book, in the Illusion of Certainty, I think there was a story you had too about with your son where you took him to the doctor early on.
Yes.
Can you share that story just so people get an idea? Yeah.
My son was about 12 years old, as I recall, and he came in and there was a big bump on the back of his leg, and we didn't know what it was, and so we called the hospital, and we found someone who could deal with young people's problems at that point, and asked the doctor what he thought. And he looked at it and he said, I'm not entirely sure, but that can be something that needs to be removed. It could be a cancer. The only problem is that we can't guarantee you that your son is going to be okay because there are a great number of nerves where this bump is, and we may cut one inadvertently, and he may have a limp or something to that effect for the rest of his life, and we really wanted you to be aware of that. So I thanked him very much, and I had a further discussion with him, and I finally looked him right in the eye, and I said, and what would you do if it was your son? And he hesitated. And I said, that's all I need. You obviously are not quite as sure as you were a few minutes ago, and I'm going to be leaving. The doctor told me that that really wasn't my option, that he wanted to and felt the absolute need to do this surgery, and that I would be held responsible for anything that happened if I walked out of the doctor's office. I said, I understand all of that. And watch me get up right now because I'm walking out of your office. And so I don't remember the exact dates, but it was like 2 to 3 months later. My son was out playing ball with a friend of his, and they were wrestling, and I heard a yell from him. And I went out, and this benign cyst had broken. And I said, thank goodness, it's over. And I said to my wife, I'm going to go back and talk to our friend in the hospital about this. She said, why don't you leave it alone? I said, well, I'm just not built that way. So I went back, explained the situation to him, and said, don't you think there's some value in what I was saying in terms, I didn't think the risks were that high that we should move ahead. I didn't have any quantitative information, but the way you've described it. He said, regardless of the outcome, I would have done the same thing again. So I thanked him for his time, and that was the end of that story. But that story stayed with me for a long time because there were a lot of messages in that story that I've run into frequently.
Well, and it sounds like that then led you on the road of what started to really look at risks and benefits. And it sounds like, I mean, what was the biggest eye-opener for me when I was reading the book, when you were breaking down risks and benefits, is just how risks and benefits are portrayed to the average person in the media, in scientific papers even. And you broke down the difference between relative risk and absolute risk. And I feel like this is a real cornerstone to this discussion so people get it. Can you break down for us what relative risk is, what absolute risk is, how they're different, and sort of an example that gives the viewers a real visceral idea of what this means? Because it's really important.
Okay, I'm going to try to do that. And I want you to know you're very perceptive because this is the key. And this is the key that has made this such a problem. There are a number of different types of risks. And if you look at statistics, they go on and on. But in terms of medical issues, in terms of how you determine whether something is good or it's bad, there are two major kinds of risks. One, as you said, are relative risks, and the other are absolute risks. It's very difficult to understand where those names came from. And frankly, I'm not sure anybody really knows because I've read about 4 or 5 different reasons. But let me use an example. And then I'll maybe use another example later on to demonstrate the differences. Because when you look at the literature and you really want to know, I don't think most people are any further ahead when they finish reading the definitions of these things. And so the example would be, let's say you picked up the New York Times and you saw a headline that said, a wonder drug reduces death from heart attacks by 50%. Now, I always start a number of my talks with 50% of what is the title for my presentation. And so when I give them this title and people listen to it, I generally then say, what do you think of that? A 50% reduction in heart attacks if you take this wonder drug. What do you all think? Raise your hand if you think it's a good thing. And basically the whole audience raises their hand. The people who know I'm going to come back with something else don't, but they all think that way. And so the next question is, 50% of what? Could any of you out there tell me what that means? Anyone? No one has ever been able to do that. Most of them don't try. No one's gotten it right. And that's where we are in this, well, I say this country, in the United States. Don't know where you are in Canada, but this is where we are in the United States. And so this is the situation. Let's say that out of 1,000 people, and you, by the way, interrupt me at any point if I'm not being clear. Okay.
No, this is very clear so far.
Okay. Let's say they came up with this number because they did a study. They had a group of 1,000 who did not take the drug, and they had a group of 1,000 who took the drug. In the group of 1,000 who didn't take the drug, there were 2 deaths, and in the case of the group of 1,000, there was 1 death. Is that clear?
Yeah. 2 deaths in a group of 1,000 that didn't take the drug, 1 death out of 1,000
okay,
that
so
did take the drug.
There was a benefit from taking this drug. However, if you do the absolute drugs, then all you do is subtract the 2 in 1,000 from 1 in 1,000 to get the difference, and the benefit is 1 in 1,000. It's very clear. You have, right?
Gotcha.
So let me tell you where the 50% comes in. And this is, before I do, this is the way all pharmaceutical companies present the benefit of their drugs. It's the way all newspapers do what the New York Times hypothetically did. That didn't happen in that newspaper, but because people are going to be interested in it. If you said there's a drug out there that's 1%, it benefits 1% of the population. In this case, it's 1/10 of 1%. No one will read the article. Okay, so where the hell did the 50% come from? This is where it came from. They subtracted, or I'm sorry, they divided, forgive me, the 2 from the 1, and that's 50%. In other words, if it's 2 minus 1, it's half. It's 1/2. Half of the people survive. And whenever you see a drug using, whenever you see a company using percents, it's usually a relative value. And so it goes from 1 in 1,000 to 50%. They don't tell you what it's 50% of. That's where it is. It's so amazing and interesting. It goes from 50% to 1 in 1,000. Now, absolute risks are the way to go. That's not because I'm saying that. It's because you really need a population to be able to evaluate whether you're willing to take the risk or not. However, when you use relative risks, you don't have access to that, and you never will. And everybody who writes articles, and if you Google this, will say the same thing I'm saying. It'll be a little more vague, only because they just assume you might know that. But no one is doing anything practical. No one is doing anything meaningful. And so that's my frustration. That's what I've been all about. And you're absolutely right. Can you imagine the difference between these 2 numbers in deciding whether you're going to take a pill or not? The 50%, boom. Well, 1 in 1,000, never. The 50% is meaningless. It's used for complicated epidemiological studies, and it works there because people understand what those numbers mean. But if you're a patient looking to see whether you should take the risk or not, it's just not there. Now, this takes a little bit of time. It took me more than a little bit of time, but it's extremely important. And it's something that if government agencies, I know in Canada, for example, you have a centralized system. If the system were willing to buy into this, then patients on their own would not need to go continually to a doctor. They would say, it isn't worth it, because now we're just talking about the benefits, but they're on the other side, even using absolute risks, which are higher than the benefits. So, and I know this is a little, I think I was trying to do the best I can. I'm not sure I did a sufficient job here, but I can give you a couple of other examples.
Yeah, give a couple other examples. I think the key thing is basically saying what a lot of the say a pharmaceutical company does when they have stats is they use relative risk because it makes the numbers look really exceptional. So saying something that has a 50% reduction makes everybody want to go and get a certain drug or a procedure done because it sounds like it's a big deal. But when you actually look at the amount of people that were involved in the study and you start to break down what was the absolute difference, it can be the difference of 50% of a relative risk, but the reality is that you're really only decreasing your risk by maybe 0.1%. And unless you actually understand the absolute risk involved, you really don't have enough information to make an informed decision. And so the idea of shared decision making really isn't possible unless the patient has all of the information in a way that they can understand it and it makes sense to them.
Yes, I agree with everything you've said, and you're spot on. The only thing I would add to it is the doctors need to know it too.
Absolutely.
Doctors need to understand, because I won't go through the statistics with you because I don't have them right here, and I'll get something wrong, which would be a bad thing to do. But there was only about 10%, this is in the US, of doctors, a study was done by JAMA, who really understand the difference between these two numbers. And understanding these two numbers is night and day. But people say, well, it's a statistic, it's a metric. We just use one or we use the other. And I've been in conferences where people have said, let's just use them both, see which one works better. It doesn't work that way. Okay, maybe I'm going on too long, but
no, that's good.
Right.
You were gonna give a couple of other examples there, and then we will go through some of the main ones in a little bit. But share whichever other examples to help illustrate that point.
What had happened when I wrote my first book with my a colleague from Johns Hopkins University? We had finished the book, and we said, let's take it back and see if we're really going to be able to convey this information to the public. And at the same time, we both said, I don't know what we were thinking of. We know what's going on, but they don't. So let's try to think of something. And so I spent 2.5 months trying to think of something. If I were a patient, if I were someone without a background, I was frightened. I was coming into an office for advice and guidance. I was looking to someone. What would I need to get the courage to say, you know, I think I want to participate in this? So I kept waking up every third night and tapping my wife on the shoulder and saying, you know, I think I got it. And she would finally tell me, if you get it, write it down, but don't wake me up again, or I'm going to get out of this house. So I did find something, and what I found was something that was familiar and recognizable to almost everybody. And I decided that we would give it a shot. And it's a theater grouping of 1,000 people. And if you can, one of the difficulties about doing a podcast like this is it's not up there. So, but it's simply, well, you've seen it. It's simply a graphic with 1,000 seats. And as you fill in those seats or darken them or don't darken them, you can tell people exactly what the risks are. So that if you only darken a seat or two, that's 2 in 1,000 or 0.1 or 0.2 in 100, most people would probably say, I don't really know if I want this medication. I don't think, although there are people who say this, I got this little notice here about low system resources. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay, but you were starting to get a bit scratchy there.
Oh, I don't know what to do.
It's
here.
okay. It sounds okay right now.
Okay. And so most of the numbers are very low, believe it or not. The benefits of drugs, the benefits of surgery, all those types of things are low. Mostly drugs, screening tests, the numbers are low. But you can see them. Some people will say, I don't care if it's 1 in a million, I want this test. They're perfectly welcome to do whatever they want. I'm not suggesting for a moment that I'm telling people anything to do. But what I'm doing is saying, have information that you can interpret and understand and appreciate, and then decide whether you're risk averse or not and move ahead. So I can start then, if that answered your question, to move on.
Yeah, well, what I want to do now is I want to take some of the really big ones that were really eye openers for me. Um, some stuff I was aware of to a point, but not to the degree that it came up when I read your book. So let's break down the benefits and risks for some of the really big topics that will be, I think, pretty surprising for people to hear. So, first one I wanted to talk about was cholesterol. Everybody knows that cholesterol is related to heart disease, or at least that's what we're told over and over again. And I'd like to know what you found when you started to really look at the numbers and the difference between the relative and the absolute risk. What came up?
Okay, I'd be happy to do that. And let me just say that we could go on for months talking about cholesterol. So what I've tried to do is pick out some of the really big ones,
Yeah,
which are going to be sort of hard to agree to. But all of our information comes from Cochrane and related groups that are independent and objective, and we're not doing any of this data gathering. All we're doing is communicating it using these theaters, and it's a
gotcha.
big difference. So, in the case of cholesterol, if you take normal blood serum cholesterol, and you consider, and most people consider that. Now, this has fluctuated over the years, but when I did these were the numbers. That about 280 mg is usually significantly elevated, and about 110 to 210 mg, not so much. And so we've found that the difference, if you have 1,000 people with elevated cholesterol and 1,000 people with low cholesterol, if you just look at cholesterol levels, only one person in 1,000, one person and more in 1,000 who has the high cholesterol will die. That's 0.1 person in 100. So if you saw these numbers, and trust me on them, they're not my numbers, they're numbers that were put out by
Yeah.
people who do this for a living. You'd think that some people might say, I'm not sure cholesterol is really the cause of heart disease. And today there are numerous articles and books that come up with the same conclusion. What they haven't done is set out this information so clear and so easy to understand. And so if I'm using myself as an example here, which is probably not a good idea, but if I see anything that's 1 in 1,000, I would take the risk. To me, that's a non-risk. Now, people I've talked to, including my wife and kids and others, feel exactly the same way. Friends and not friends feel exactly that. Now, there always is a person out there who says, well, I don't care if it's 1 in a million, I want the drugs. But the drugs aren't necessarily a great thing for you. But in this case, it's the presence of blood serum cholesterol levels. Amazing number, is it not? Okay, so
I think
when you
that's
talk about
amazing because,
cholesterol, the next thing you really want to talk about is statins. The
well, so
statins
yeah, so the first thing with cholesterol, basically what the numbers show is that possibly 1 out of every 1,000 person that keeps their cholesterol under what we recognize as being an elevated cholesterol may prevent themselves from a cardiovascular incident.
correct. That's
That's
correct.
basically it. 1 out of 1,000.
That's
So
correct.
0.1%.
Correct. And you have to decide what you have to decide, as does everybody else. But we felt that this is the other thing about this graphic. If you would put this information in a rectangle or a box, it wouldn't resonate. But when you look at this theater, they see themselves in it. They see the seats around them, and people can grab onto it. We've gotten, I hate to say this because it's a little embarrassing, but we've gotten a lot of, wow, that's a good, you're right. This makes a lot of sense. So not that it's moving anywhere in the States, but okay, that's okay. So you use, everybody knows that in order to reduce cholesterol, that you take statins. And statins, as you probably know, block a liver enzyme responsible for cholesterol production. And statins really do significantly reduce cholesterol. But when I come back to that first graphic, you really wonder if statins, and if they do any good, and that's also up in the air too, but that reducing cholesterol may not be a wonderful thing, and which I'll tell you in a minute, that's what people are saying about statins. But they're also now beginning to say they're not sure that statins are worth the negative impacts associated with them. And I read an article recently, and I copied part of it here for this talk, they focus on something called statistical deception. Exactly what I was talking about. They just called it up. And that's why statins are being used. There was an analysis of data in the statin trials, which led them to conclude that statin advocates use statistical deception to create the illusion that statins are wonder drugs, when the reality is that their modest benefits are more than offset by their adverse effects. Well, now, how could that be? Because everybody knows statins are good for you. Well, there's a study that proves it, and it'll also go back to my idea of absolute and relative. So there's a study called the Ascot LLA study a number of years ago, where the individuals were broken into two groups. One group was a placebo group, which was not treated at all, and 3% of that group died of heart attacks. The other group, they had 1.9% of the group who were taking Lipitor. Lipitor, as you know, is a form of the statins. So the difference is from 3% to 1.9%, if one were using absolute risks, would be about 1.1%, right? That's the difference between the two.
1.1%
1%
reduction in your risk.
However, if you take the 3 and you compare it to the 2, the 1.9, then the effect is 36% reduction in heart attacks from taking Lipitor. So it goes from 1.1%, which everybody would say, oh,
why bother?
Acronym, because it's not very nice. But if you say 36%, if I heard 36%, I'd put everybody on it. And so this is a real life situation, which follows step by step my little hypothetical situation of the heart drugs. So the final thing that these guys said, by the way, I called them recently because I just got into this, interesting, but they say, and I'm quoting them, increased rates of cancer, cataracts, diabetes, cognitive impairments, and musculoskeletal disorders more often offset, this is from Lipitor, the modest cardiovascular benefits of statin treatment. Now these guys are PhDs and MDs, and there's professors. I don't have their permission, but this was in an expert review of clinical pharmacology. So, when you hear all this, you have to say, he's making this up. It can't be true. But what I just gave you, but I thought it would be good to give you things that I didn't look like I was coming up with. Now, when you look at statins, it is true that if you give people statins who have never had a heart attack, they call it primary prevention, then about 3 out of 1,000 benefit when compared to people who did not. And then when you compare these people who had previous heart attacks, it's about 6. So the difference is 3 in 1,000 people benefit if they didn't have a heart attack or if they did have a heart attack. So those are, you might say 3 in 1,000, but it's between 3 and 100. It's not a big number. So I would predict, if I would live this long, it isn't going to happen. But if I did, I will predict that statins will soon absolutely be worthless. And not only worthless, but if you start doing these theaters, which we haven't, on these different endpoints which I just gave you, then you'll see that people will go, oh my goodness. And so, there are problems with the liver because that's where it goes, and that's where it goes to get rid of the enzyme, and on and on. So
I think that's an important point, though, because it's the thing is that a lot of people will decide to accept the side effects because they think that the benefits are so profound. So when you hear like close to 40% reduction in a cardiovascular problem if you are taking a statin, then you might be okay with the chances of having certain side effects and muscle problems and even maybe liver damage if the percentages don't look that high. But when you actually think, well, I'm actually only really reducing my risk by 0.3 or maximally 0.6, you might start to think twice about whether or not 0.3 risk reduction really makes sense versed on all of the different problems that could potentially happen from it, because it's so negligible.
Absolutely. Makes a big difference.
Yeah. All right, next one on the list, let's talk about mammograms.
Okay. Mammograms are interesting. The numbers, and this has been demonstrated by a number of very well-known research groups, is approximately that if you have 1,000 people who don't take mammograms over a lifetime, and 1,000 women who do take mammograms over a lifetime, those who do take it will have one less death than the other. So it's 1 out of 1,000, 0.1 out of 100. And the problem is that mammograms aren't peachy. Mammograms cause a lot of problems. So you keep that 0.1 in 100 versus 1 in 1,000 in the back of your mind, and then you look a little bit into, for example, the frequency of false positives in abnormal mammograms, and you find out that there are about, let me see if I can find this, an additional 64 women represented by, which would be these blackened seats, who require a biopsy for what proves to be a benign lesion compared to 1,000 who are not screened. So I know a woman, and my wife knows a woman, who had a real problem with that. And they hit an artery, and she died after that. This has nothing to do with it, but it was a very serious problem. So if anybody were given this number in a theater, the previous number in a theater, and then there's one here which I won't go into, but unnecessary treatment as a result of mammograms, that also can lead to serious problems. And so to me, when my wife asks me, and she does because she knows these things, do you really think I should get a mammogram? Now, we're at an age where no one's supposed to get anything. But when she was younger, I said, don't do it. And from my point of view here, but I want to show you these theaters. And I showed them to her, and she said, why would anybody do that? And can I give you one more anecdote?
Yes, absolutely.
We gave a talk at Johns Hopkins University at the medical school, and we showed these theaters on mammogram. The woman stood up in the back. She said, I don't mean to interrupt you. She's a doctor. She said, are you telling me about the one, is that accurate? I said, yeah, you have the same information that we do. You have the same medical journals. Look it up. And she looked out just in the blue and said, why the hell would I want to do this again? And I didn't answer her, of course, but I said, well, at least you're thinking about it again. And I'm not sure that you won't stay with the same view that you have. And so this is, even the doctors at the best places
Yeah.
haven't done this. Now, my partner, who went to Brown University in the States, he graduated magna cum laude, and he said they never learned this. They never learned this all through medical school. And all the groups we talked to, I asked them, do you know the difference between absolute and relative? No, we really don't. We don't know if that's important. Okay, so
well,
does that all
yeah,
make sense?
And what you were saying with the mammograms, I got the numbers from you here too, and it was over 500 out of every 1,000 women screened were also having abnormalities on their mammogram. They were, so they are like, for false positives, about half out of every 1,000 often have false positives, which then means that increases your stress. You have to get retesting. Then a certain percentage of that ends up being biopsies. And I think you even found a small percentage, about 2.4 out of every 1,000, ended up actually having treatment with either radiation, chemo, surgery that were never even required.
Yes, and I didn't go through that because I'm not sure how much time you have, but yes, that's exactly correct.
Just think that was really amazing. So it's when you think about it that way, 2.4 out of every 1,000 could end up having treatment for something that they didn't need treatment for, versus 1 out of every 1,000 that might actually avert death from breast cancer.
Yep. It's remarkable, no?
Yeah. All right, next one on the list, colonoscopy.
All right. Colonoscopies are tough because one of the things that isn't included in these graphics. I try to be as upfront as I can. It's a technique of mine. I feel it's better doing life that way. Actually, most people who don't have a family history of it will probably shouldn't be scanned in the first place, but they have a lesser risk to begin with. But let's assume that everything is done the way it's supposed to be done here. And as you can see, there are about 2.5 people, which will be represented by these black seats, who will have major complications, such as bowel perforation, and with a surgery, if something went awry. Now, as it turns out, I think it's about the same number of people, it is, that would prevent the death from not having a colonoscopy. So if you don't have it, about 2.5 extra people are going to die over a lifetime, and if you do have it, about 2.5 people are going to be seriously hurt if you do. And there are some other little things in here, but those are the main issues. And you can see one more thing. There's a theme here. The numbers, picking out 1,000 was not just random. There are very few actual effects from either screening tests or drugs or other types of things. And we just wanted to make that known to people, because when you hear about it, it comes out exactly the opposite. It comes out in big numbers.
So you're having to use numbers in 1,000 because the overall benefit is not that high. So you're having to do it in a group of 1,000. You can't even do it in a group of 100 because it's so far off from that.
That's correct. Now, a great philosopher, his name he's a U.S. Philosopher, he said, motives are always suspect when it comes to why the pharmaceutical companies keep doing this and why the newspapers keep doing this, and on and on. That's true technically, but in my not so nice brain, I think everybody knows exactly what they're doing and what's going on, and they keep doing it, and no one can figure out. The bad part about this is no one can figure out. See, what we have in this graphic that we have, if someone says, yeah, I got a better one, that's okay too, but the fact is, no one says, you're right, we ought to use these. And to the life of me, right now, I can't understand why people don't do it. Don't say, look, is this your license? Is this your intellectual property? And it is, as it turns out. We'll give you this because we can, if this was ours, on and on, it's some blockage. And I'm just being, when you get to be my age, you'll stop being able to just talk and not care that much. But that's really where it is and where we are.
Well, I think you shine a light on something that's been going on for years. And I'm sure when the companies sort of thought, I mean, from my side, how I would see it the same way you are, but I'm sure at some level they went, wow, this is a real statistic that we can use, that we're going to use it sort of in an inappropriate way, but it's still a legitimate statistic. So let's use it because it makes things sound so much better than it does if we just give really absolute risk values that really show such limited benefits to so many things.
Now, my partner, Andy Lazarus, who is a family doctor here in the States, this is all he uses. And his patients just say things to him. I'm using the words, but they're all older. He's a gerontologist. They all say to him, why the hell didn't you show it this earlier? Now we can decide what we want and what we don't want. We don't understand the other stuff. Yeah. And it is true. I don't see doctors frequently at all, basically, but I feel that if I had a serious problem, and I've had problems, but if I had a serious problem, I wouldn't be able to think straight. I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't know how to do it. And I would want to listen to somebody give me answers. However, if the answers aren't good answers, that's not a good way to go. And if we keep working together, one of these days I will tell you about my heart attack 4 years ago. And it's a great story. And actually, I was a lead author with Andy on an article for JAMA, and they published the whole thing. So it was it was interesting. I can
You'll
send
have
it
to
to
send me the link to that. All right, next one on the list is bone density scans.
Okay, we as you can see, I think it's two examples of that here, and one of them has to do with, they both have to do with bisphosphonates, and we found out that if you that out of 1,000 women in a theater who use these bisphosphonates for over 5 years, approximately 20 more of them will sustain low impact femur fractures than those who take a placebo. So that's not a good thing to see. And even though 20 out of 1,000 is 2 out of 100, it's still not a good thing to see. So if you're taking a drug to prevent something that's causing it, you might want to think twice. And there was a lot done on this, but my feeling is if the medical community, the appropriate doctors and physicians were to use this technique, it would enable them to communicate information more accurately and more effectively. Not that they want to do that or they want to take the time to do that, I can't speak for them, but it just seems like that's where it should be in the future.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I think the last one on the list was the PSA testing for prostate.
Oh, yes.
Or no, not last one. We had one more after that, but PSA testing.
Okay. Okay. The PSA testing, PSA is prostate serum antigen, and prostate cancer, as you well know, can either be indigent and you'll die of something else, or it can be aggressive. Pretty much in both cases, there's nothing much you can do. If it's indolent and they tell you it's indolent, even if they don't, if it is, you'll die of something else. And if it's at the point where they see it happening, it's sort of like pancreatic cancer, there's not a great deal you could do. But there was which I don't have with me right now, but let me use that because it's more recent. There was a major study done in Great Britain on prostate cancer and PSA, and they wanted to know the value of PSA. This study cost a lot of money. It was a huge group, don't remember the exact numbers. And they came out that if you had PSA testing for the time of your life that you needed, 3 individuals would die from prostate cancer. And if you never got PSA testing, 3 people would die from prostate cancer. There's absolutely no difference between the two. So a little anecdote, which you, I'm sure, expected from me at this point. No one was paying any attention to it. So I wrote to this guy, who was the head of a hospital group, and I said, I thought your study was absolutely first class, and I can't figure out why no one's paying any attention to this. You're saying a lot here. And so I said, why don't you look at these theaters and see if it makes any sense to you? You can demonstrate by using these. So I had 2 theaters of 1,000, each with 3 dots in them, and one for one and one for the other. He said to me, this is an amazing idea. Whose idea was this? I said, well, it's my idea, and thanks for the compliment, but why don't you, it's yours, why don't you just attach that to your, people all over the place are going to be saying, oh, that's what you're talking about. But right now, they don't know what you're talking about. They can't, if they do, they're afraid to say something because there's technical words in there. He said, you're right. I'll get back to you. So about 3 months later, he got back to me, and he said, I'm terribly embarrassed to tell you this, but I can't convince these people for political reasons to incorporate this document. And he just said, I wish you nothing but the best of luck. He said a lot of nice things, which is going to make it embarrassing for me to say. I said, listen, you're calling me and telling me that is sufficient. Thank you very much. If you think you've had delays, you have no idea. So that's PSA. And my brother recently called me about PSA, and I gave him this information. He said, damn, Eric, why the hell didn't you give me this before? And I'm not going in there. So it's breaking through, which is my problem right now, but I do hope these theaters made some sense. I hope they were legible. I hope I was
Oh, those,
able to be
I think
understood.
they're fantastic. And what we will do is we'll, with your permission, if there's even the video you sent, if I can use that as a link on the show notes, if people are able to go and watch the video that you guys presented, because you guys did a good job with breaking it down and visualizing it really well. And that'll be another way for people to really grasp the concept. One last one. I don't know if you have the notes for this one, but the other one that I found really fascinating was aspirin and the prevention of heart disease and stroke.
Oh, yes. Let me see if I got that here. Shoot. Bear with me for just a second.
Yeah, that's okay.
Oh, okay. I got it.
Because again,
Okay,
we're all
so-
told that taking an aspirin a day substantially decreases your, like a baby aspirin a day or so, substantially decreases your risk of cardiovascular incident.
Okay, so what we found in the literature was if you take 1,000 healthy men in the theater who take aspirin regularly, approximately 6 will have some reduction in adverse cardiac outcomes compared to 1,000 men who take a placebo. I'm sorry, but 3 will have an increase in stroke. So the difference is 3. And that's how this 3 came up. But if you hear something like that, it's not very reassuring that you're not going to be the one that has the stroke. And so that's where that is pretty much.
So 6 people out of 1,000 might decrease cardiovascular outcomes, but they would increase 3 out of 1,000 to get a stroke. So the wash on it is that you might get 3 out of 1,000 benefits to being on an asprin. 3
Correct.
out of 1,000.
And we sort of added them together. Yeah, we added them together because it was aspirin, but I'm not sure that's kosher. But that's sort of what we did. So it's another small number. Everything's a small numbers, and we picked 1,000 because we knew we could get it in, and it seemed to resonate more than if we'd use 100 or 10,000. It just seemed like the right way to go. So it's neat. It's interesting. Glad you like it.
Oh, I honestly, I feel like it is, I feel like, quite honestly, if people read your books and they took that to heart, and medical doctors and physicians prescribing these different tests routinely, just because that's what everybody is taught, and that's the numbers that they're shown, are all relative risks. So it makes sense. They're doing it because in their mind, it makes sense. But if they actually knew the real truth of it and could then relay that information to their patients, I really feel like millions of people, you would be reducing unnecessary treatments and unnecessary suffering. I mean, it would be a huge impact on people's overall well-being. So
yeah,
I'm a fan of your work, and I really hope that this message gets out more and more. Erik, thank you so much for your time and your energy and your expertise. If people want to learn more about you and the work you're doing, where's the best place for them to reach you?
My email is erifkin, RIFKIN 102 at AOL.com. My phone number in the States is 410-371-2491.
Wonderful. I'll make sure that I put your information in our show notes so that people can get a hold if you have any questions. Been an absolute pleasure, and I appreciate so much the work you guys are doing.
Well, Jason, it's been an honor. Thank you very much.
Okay, you take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye, Erik.
Bye.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to invest in your health and well-being. Since this podcast is brand new, reviews and subscribers are so vital for us to get off the ground and share this really important information. So if you found this information valuable, please post a review and subscribe to the podcast so you'll get our newest episodes. Also, if you know of someone who would benefit from this, please share it with them. You can also find us on Instagram at #InspireHealthPodcast. If you have a question that you'd like to be addressed, direct message me on Instagram or leave a comment on one of my posts. I would love to hear from you. And you can grab our show notes and free resources for each episode at inspirehealthpodcast.com. So be sure to go online and check it out.